Hi, everybody. This is Garrett Justice, the host of Brandland. For today's episode, we have a very special guest on, Liz Brown, who is the CMO at Little League International. And for those of you who hadn't tuned into our episode last week, I'd encourage you to do so. This is part 2 of this series of an awesome conversation with Liz about the process that the Little League went through to launch a new brand back in 2020. So this is part 2 of that series where you'll hear Liz kind of jump right into what that process was like for launching the brand and the post-launch and wrapping up with some of her learnings. But I think that if you enjoy this episode, you'll really enjoy part 1 too. So I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that, which is really setting the stage for why they wanted to do this rebrand as the Little League and what that discovery process was like and the brand development phase was like before the launch. And so again, I'd encourage you to go back and check that one out. But without further ado, we'll jump right into this then. The part of the conversation where we're talking with Liz about the launch of this brand and the learnings post-launch. So hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. We've kind of talked about this pre-launch phase. Now we move into like the brand launch. And I know you organized this initially around in June, right? Which was the anniversary of the Little League. Is that right?
Yes. So June 6th every year is the anniversary of Little League. We're over 80 years old. So we had picked that date as a prime way to begin kind of kicking off all of our initiatives. And it was 2020.
Yeah. And so that was my next question is, June in 2020, obviously you started this months before pre-pandemic, but how did that pandemic then change or make you pivot at that point, if at all, what your plan was for launch?
So the idea of overthinking is sometimes a good thing. And so we were going through as an organization, everything that was happening in 2020 with our leagues having to pause their seasons, with the pandemic really becoming, a US and global issue and us understanding more about the impact on our organization. And then looking at this and saying, is there still a place for this now? Should we hold? Should we move? And at that point, trying to remember back and put your mindset in it is sometimes hard, but we were really thinking about moving forward because one of the core pieces of the launch was this idea of a tagline or a campaign that we could launch each year. And so we had this idea of one team, one Little League. It wasn't what we were going to launch with, to be honest with you. We had a completely different thematic that we were going to launch with, but as you were seeing communities where our volunteers were present, who were on the front lines, they were healthcare workers, they were, in a service business, they were restaurant, people struggling, whatever it may be, it felt like the right theme for the community of Little League to rally around. And so we decided as a team and got our senior leadership support to keep going. Now, we scaled back significantly in the way we launched, because at the same time that this was happening, we were also seeing the issues of social injustice happening. And we wanted to be very sensitive and considerate and not have, a loud voice during a time when that wasn't appropriate. So, we did, I guess to reinforce it, but we did lean into one team, one Little League, because we truly believe in the mission that Little League is for everyone and belongs in communities, all of all shapes and sizes, and it has its place. And so we did feel like it was still the right time to go forward and reintroduce what we were doing. And what we found was that there was an openness and maybe a willingness to learn and listen at a time for us that in any normal year, this is the beginning of our tournament season. So it is very busy. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of attention. And that's one of the reasons we had picked it in the first place. But in a year like 2020, it was an opportunity to kind of connect with that volunteer base in a way that they had some headspace to think about it a little bit differently than what they normally would be doing for us in any other given year. So I'm going to just sort of note, I think any brand launch or relaunch requires a ton of thought and discussion, but this one we we spent hours just, in some ways agonizing, like, should we go forward or not? And I also think there was an element of our internal team, like, we needed this, like, we had worked so hard for so long and spent so much of our energy on it. And it was so good to see it finally just get out the door too, and have that bit of sort of personal fulfillment as well for the team that was a part of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. From an outsider's perspective, from my perspective, what I think is really interesting hearing about that kind of pivot that you took in terms of that tagline is it's clear that as you went through this process, and from an outsider's perspective, that team first, that one team, one little league, that team first collaborative environment is such a key part of the Little League brand. And what I think is so fascinating about that is, often we go through these processes of identifying the attributes and what we stand for as a brand. And then we sometimes forget how we can apply that and to play a role when broader societal impacts take place. So again, going back to, from my perspective, it's fascinating that you identified that team focused attribute as a core piece of the brand. And there was a perfect time and opportunity, despite the challenges, and the reality of that we're faced in the world, there was a perfect opportunity for your brand to actually live up to that at that launch and say, hey, we talk about being team first, but no, we really are. And it's interesting hearing, all of the thought process that went into that. But I love that focus was kind of switched to highlight that attribute because it was applicable to what was happening in the world at the time.
Yep. Nope, 100%. And that was all part of our thought process.
That's great. So you had this somewhat softer launch than what you had initially intended. What did that look like? What was that launch like, and what were the elements that you had scaled back from the initial plans?
Yeah, so I would say the initial plan was a sort of 360 integrated marketing plan. You can imagine every touch point, including some mailings to our volunteers that would give them something to hold and feel like they have connection, shifted almost entirely to a digital, sort of effort. So leveraging all our channels and really starting with another employee training session about a week before to give them all the tools so that, June 6th was a weekend, but slightly after first business day, you have all your letterhead, you have PowerPoint template, all the things you're going to need, your logo and your signature, really training the employees on all those tools that they knew were coming, but taking them through and having the resources for them to lean on to kick it off too. And then, leaning into One Team, One Little League, we have a really powerful social media presence through some of the sort of staple networks, and our website, launching that brand presence on the website with video and a really compelling story explaining the messaging, some of the colors, the way we're launching. And then last but not least, we have sort of an access point for our volunteers. That's more of a closed off website that they can visit. And we made logos for every district that we have. So, Pennsylvania District 12, as an example, to some of our international markets, we found that we had some time to create logos for, over 600 different districts and countries. And we put them onto this proprietary website, and we're able to say, you can start using it now. Here's the files, go ahead and download it. And so kind of launching with some staple tools, if you will, like a logo, like some flyers and some templates, was all part of what the June 6th launch plan that kind of survived, if you will, the change. But pivoting from, some of those grander plans that we definitely had to scale that back. And we've begun to implement some of them now, but we still have kind of a rolling schedule or timeline that we'll look to implement over the years to come.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about that. What are those plans for continuing to launch and relaunch this new brand update as you move into the future?
So it's funny, I had a brand team meeting this morning, kind of a check-in. So one thing we're doing is just continuing to collect feedback and questions. So, every couple of days we'll get various emails from our leagues or districts asking for a different way to use the logo. So we've started to create kind of a database of that, and not necessarily flex 100% yet on those usage requests, but consider them as maybe some flexibility we're going to need to give moving forward and how we're going to structure that. And so I think that's really important. And then looking ahead, the number of things that we didn't do this year, I mean, we have physical facilities, we have events that we hold, things that you can't easily control with a digital change, right, are all part of our long-term plan. So, I mean, everything from the roofs of our stadiums have our logo on them, to building signage, to business cards. I mean, a lot of us haven't been traveling, so we haven't had to go to a meeting yet, but over time we will go ahead and push print on those business cards that we held back on. So again, I think we're being conservative and really placing the emphasis on the things that are most important in the coming months, with the flexibility that we need to change and evolve and grow. And I would say for a person who does think brand, the hardest part is not to have everything finished, right?
Yeah,
and to turn around and see your old logo. And I think for us, we always envisioned that this was going to be, an evolution over many years, that we weren't going to be able to change things overnight. And so that was always our mindset from the beginning. And I think it's made it a little easier for us to tackle projects with the sort of 2020 year and 2021, moving into 2021, with that in mind, and not feel like we haven't succeeded.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I can understand how that can be challenging for someone who has spent all of this time and wants all of that new brand and the visual identity of that out there live in the wild. And it can be hard for that rollout. One of the things I like about that, though, as you kind of mentioned, is it's going to be consistently you're going to be consistently reminding employees and volunteers later on as you continue to roll things out and do more of these kind of mini launches. I think sometimes we put all of that emphasis into that one main big launch and we think that it's done, where the reality is, I mean, it's going to take people some time to kind of come around to this new idea and figure out the new ways they should use this and shouldn't and everything else. And so I like that, even though it can be challenging as that marketer or brand person, to not have it all out there live, I like that it has a built-in way to remind people and bring them along for months or maybe even years to come, which I think in the end will hopefully help you have more buy-in and consistency, right?
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Fascinating. So you've gone through this brand launch where you have done this pivot, you kind of scaled back a little bit. You have these plans for continuing to relaunch this and roll it out in the future. So you're kind of post-launch now, even though some elements, right, are going to continue to be rolled out. What is that post-launch phase? What does that kind of look like for you after that initial launch? I think you talked about, you've already started building this database of different ways that people are requesting to use, the logo and things like that. But what else has there been in that post-launch phase?
I think there's been a really good approach to using the messaging. So one of the things that I thought was just brilliant of our team and our agency that we developed was what we called a copy playbook. So, you find yourself in presentations or in discussions where you just want to have a couple of things that you can say about the brand, right? One Team One Little League was actually in the copy playbook, believe it or not. We went through it, we pulled that out. But that resonate and have staying power. And so that actually, the copy playbook has a huge role in developing email messaging, advertising, banner ads or whatnot, because we look through the book and we say sort of what fits our need right now. There are hundreds of sayings and hundreds of points in there. So we're right now, I think, in this sort of next phase, really leaning into that and making sure that we're using those messages, the community of Little League, the power, those things that sort of evolved through that tone and message development, making sure it's being infused into everything we're doing. So you're seeing our creative change, you're seeing that messaging change, and you're seeing, I think, this sort of freshness to how we're talking on a regular basis. So I think that's only going to increase as some of the, what I'll call trailing projects of signs and collateral and other things will come along as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think that there can often be a tendency to get so excited about this new brand and the visual expression of that to want to, use it all together at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
How have you helped to kind of coach your teams and volunteers and everyone else on, not overusing that brand and showing the right constraint there?
I think it's hard, number one. But again, back to the brand team, and actually, there's a few folks on our team who they just really fell in love with this process and this project. And so they've become stewards, right, on a regular basis. And I remember at one point as we went out, and we have to remember that there was like 8 of us looking at this as on a regular basis. So in some ways it was already overused for us when we launched because we had spent so much time on it. But there was a couple of things we had emailed out and maybe used in a very short amount of time. And someone raised their hand and said, I think we have a problem. Like, we need to be careful we're not doing too much, whether it was the color or the elements we had created or whatnot. And it was a really good discussion and reminder that we need to be really just thoughtful about all the things we now can use now that we've launched and not overuse them. On the volunteer side or the field side of things, I think number one, the approach we've had is to just be understanding that it's all new too. And we did get excitement. And so if we see something that, makes us pause, it's okay. Let's just figure out if it's worth addressing or we're better off kind of watching and waiting and seeing what happens. And so whether that was sort of in the employee side or in the volunteer side, that's the approach we've taken. We've had to have a couple of difficult conversations over the last couple of months, like, hey, here's a suggestion of maybe how to do it differently, or this is the fonts we're using or the colors we're using. Try again next time. And that is tough, but it's expected to. And I don't think anybody's surprised if they, hear from us that we're looking for the use of the new templates or the new tools, because we created them all and they're all available. So
yeah, that makes total sense. What I like about what you said too is I think that, as I've talked to lots of different marketing leaders out there through this podcast and the work that I've done with Lucid Press, one of the things that I found is that the really successful organizations who are building strong brands focus more from that central marketing or brand team on empowering everyone else across the org rather than policing. And, there's an element of that policing and, that needs to happen at times. But I love that you talked about, just coaching people along and having understanding and really empowering them to want to and know how to, express that brand in a consistent way. So what are the other tools or resources or education things that you provided, especially those out in the field or volunteers, to help empower them now to express that brand in the right way? You kind of talked about this portal you set up with logos. What else was there that you did to empower?
So I think, again, I go back a little bit to communication. Number one, I think people always feel better when they know they can get in touch with someone. So like branding@littleleague.org became a very active email address for both employees and the field to use. And we said, if you have questions or ideas, just call us and let's talk about it. And so I think that was sort of point number one. From there, we've evolved our web tools to include flyers that can be downloaded. We're in the phase right now for many parts of the country, even with the pandemic, that leagues are registering families to play. Maybe their start date of the season may be a little bit on hold, but they're starting to get their pool of players together. So having tools to be able to create signs and create flyers and emails has been really important. And so those have been the things that we've been pushing or sort of communicating more so now, given the seasonality of our program and what we're leaning into. You'll then see as we go into the summer and our tournament season, where the World Series logos come into play, there's a marriage between some of those assets, and you'll start to see that come into apparel and some other areas as well. So, again, it's been baby steps given the pivot we did or the shift in 2020, but we have all those plans in our book, right? And so it's just a matter of when are we going to push the button and kind of implement some of the future thought there too.
Awesome. I love that. Last question on this is, you kind of talked about bringing those employees and those volunteers along. Was that a similar process when it comes to aligning with partners, right? And others that you might work at or work with who aren't necessarily within the walls of your organization, if you will?
Yes. So just take whether it's our sponsors or our licensees or other partners that we have, it was just as important on June 6th to launch with our volunteers and our sort of fan group and parents as it was to launch with our partners. So we created, custom logo lockups for each of our sponsors. We made sure our licensees had the new marks to use so they could begin creating products with those new marks, and provided each of them, kind of a walkthrough of the style guide that was, accompanying all those and how to use it and how to get approvals and things like that. And being able to see partners use it. And again, back to flexibility, partner brands, just like our brand, have their own guidelines and color sets and free space and all those things. And so we did have to be flexible too, that what we created also probably needed to evolve based on what the partner mark was as well. So, again, seeing them use it as, an official sponsor of Little League and putting it in applications that were relevant, was definitely part of the process and was a, kind of a welcomed piece for them to begin seeing how a new mark could improve how we looked together collectively as a brand group.
It's awesome. Liz, this has just been fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time to just kind of share this experience with us of, what that discovery phase looked like, that brand development, then the launch and kind of the post-launch for you. As we kind of wrap up here, I just have a couple other questions for you. As we think back about what we talked about today, if you could kind of go back in time and give yourself, before you started this process, a few pieces of advice, what would that be?
A few, there's probably many. I think, number one, because again, I'm sort of a marketing generalist, maybe not an expert in brand. And so there was a huge learning. I think one piece of advice would be that to make sure I always reminded myself and our team, which I did, that this project was worth doing, right? That, we had to get buy-in, and that sometimes was really hard to bring folks along of what we were trying to do, to consider it a brand that needed some evolution of some things like the mission statement. That was hard, but it was worth doing. And where we are now is so much better than where we were. So I think that's definitely one piece. And it goes along with the idea of staying the course, as you went through and June 6th or not, kind of evaluating those launch, staying the course and making sure we saw it through. The other thing we did, and this was a great thing that came later, and I wish I had done it earlier in the process, was, we have a great group of partners or industry leaders that we work with. We work with Major League Baseball, Adidas, Dick's Sporting Goods. I mean, these are brands that are renowned and well-known and have amazing creative teams. And we have access to all of them. And, as we got through different phases, I started to lean on them for more feedback. Like, what do you think? Like, what does this say to you? Is this resonating? Yeah. I mean, I remember having some conversations with the creative team at Major League Baseball, and having them give us the kind of attaboy just made us feel so good that we were on the right track. So again, I think maybe leaning on our network a little earlier or getting them also involved in that kind of discovery process could have been a piece that we evaluated, but I do think we did bring them in and learn from them at the right time as well.
Well, I bet that could be so validating for your team, especially who's spending so much time and effort thinking about this all day, every day, just to have that, hey, you're doing good, you're headed in the right direction, which I think is probably so important just for the morale there and the excitement, because there's so much work that goes into that. So
yep, definitely a confidence boost for our team.
That's awesome. Well, last question I have for you, Liz, is, what does the future of the Little League International brand look like? What's in the future? What's on the horizon? What are you talking about and having planned?
So I think some of it we've actually started to bring to life, but I think we're going to continue to develop what I'll call sub-brands, right? So we actually have, with the strategic plan, a number of initiatives that, whether we're naming or we're needing to bring to life, that are TBD, not totally defined yet. And so one of them, as an example, is last summer we launched a program called Little League Sandlot Fun Days, which is the idea of alternative play, where kids can just come out to the field and sort of have an experience with the sport, but not be so regimented about the typical Little League game experience. And so that sub-brand, we have trademarked, we developed an identity for it that worked with the main brand, the master brand, but had its own unique flair to it. And so we're going to have some other initiatives like that are going to need the same kind of due diligence that we put into developing the master brand. But I think now that we have this foundation, it will just be a better process for us to go through. I think our creatives have really embraced the templates that we now have to work from versus really starting from scratch on programs like that.
That makes sense. I'm excited to see those continue to roll out in the future.
Thank you.
Well, Liz, thank you again so much for taking the time today. This has been fascinating. I think that there's so many learnings that, anyone out there can take and apply in their own businesses. If there are listeners that have follow-up questions for you or want to get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
So I'm on LinkedIn under Liz DeLulo Brown, and or at Little League at ebrown@littleleague.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Liz, and we will talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks so much.